Hello, everybody. My name is Brianna Beretta, and I'm here with the 97.3 ESPN Flyers insider Kevin Durso. We are going to be going over the last couple of games for the Philadelphia Flyers. So, starting off, why don't we start with the game yesterday? That was a 4-1 loss against the Carolina Hurricanes. John Tortorella came across after the game in a press conference saying that both efforts on both teams just looked flat, especially on the Flyers. And what do you think about that?
It was a really ugly game, and he was right to say that. It was an ugly game for both sides. A lot of lulls throughout the course of the middle of the game, especially. Carolina came out decent to start the game. They got the first goal of the game. The Flyers had an early power play that went by the wayside. So early on, it seemed like it was okay pace and things like that. And I thought the middle of the game was just kind of boring and slow, and both teams kind of sloppy throughout. You could see a lot of that was one of the biggest problems the Flyers had throughout the course of the game was execution was just off, and that can be attributed to being flat from pretty much the drop of the puck. So I'm not surprised by his reaction to that game. I kind of felt the same way. It was leaning towards being a game, let's be real, it was leaning towards being a game that was a 2-1 final, hold for the late goal that they get that kind of, Carter Hart said it got stuck underneath of his pad and ended up in the net as a result. He said the shot was going wide, and just kind of one of those fluke things that he even said, doesn't typically happen. That kind of changed the whole complexion of the final score to make it 4-1. It was really a 2-1 game throughout. So just one of those games where there's not a lot to take away from it. It was just kind of boring and slow and ugly. And, sometimes that favors a team, especially a team like Carolina, who has many different ways about them in which they can win games. So it favors a team like that can do those things, and it doesn't necessarily favor a team that doesn't have the talent level and has to really grind it out for every single thing that they get and hasn't really been scoring a lot lately. So tough one for the Flyers in that respect.
So it's a crazy kind of like back and forth there because they went from that game being told they were flat in every effort to probably one of the more exciting games of the season the other night. They went full regulation game against the Islanders, no score, full overtime, no score, and then took it to, I think, the fifth shooter in the shootout with Tyson Forster winning the game. So do you think that again, no score throughout that game, is just kind of show of a lack of offense or kind of a display of the defense stepping up their game in the season?
I mean, it's a little bit of both, and I think that the lack of offense has been a problem over the last handful of games. I mean, if you go beyond the 5-game winning streak that they were just on, and they were scoring pretty solidly throughout. It was 22 goals they had over the course of those 5 games. And since then, they've played 4 games. They've lost 3 of them. And in the 4 games, they've scored a total of 4 goals. So they're struggling to find offense right now and to finish off opportunities when they get them. And part of that to me is the way that every one of these teams that they've faced has played. They faced the Islanders twice. They faced the Rangers. They faced the Hurricanes. These are teams that have that kind of style, that clamp down in the neutral zone, that don't allow a whole lot in the offensive zone, that play a defensive style turned offense. And that really, it just fed right into the way that those teams like to play. And the Flyers got the performance to match defensively in that game on Saturday when everybody steps up and plays well in the defensive zone. Everybody's kind of taking away the time and space that the offense needs to try to make any opportunity. The goaltending was obviously outstanding from Sam Ersson in that game. So collectively, that effort was on point and what they needed to have. And they really, for better parts of that game, controlled the game and had more opportunities. But it was kind of the anomaly of the last 4 was that game. And in all of the other ones I've seen, especially because of the fact that, when they played the Islanders the first time last week, when they played the Rangers, when they played the Hurricanes, they're giving up the first goal of the game. They're giving it up relatively early. 2 of those games, it was within the first 2 minutes. So when that happens, you immediately kind of go into chasing the game mode. And when you do those things and start chasing the game, you get away from the things that have made your game the strongest. And I think that that's something that we've seen over the course of these last handful of games, is that when they fall behind, they have to get away from the things that have really made them successful in the games that they've won. And it's hard to get back to those sound defensive fundamentals that you've had that help you win the games when you're leading, when you're trailing in the game and you feel the need to be a little more aggressive, to take a few more chances, to try things that maybe you wouldn't try typically. And when that happens, it just doesn't work out in your favor some nights. And that's the way that it kind of has been over the last handful of games for the Flyers.
So I wouldn't say at this point that it's like a end all be all of the season. They're still playing strong. Their puck control still seems to be increasing with every game. But at this point in time, it is kind of that type of area you said last week where, like, if you're in playoff contention now, you're in playoff contention for the season, and they're not out of the race. But what do you think is these factors that they're going to have to put into their game to actually make them a playoff contender, or at least, maybe first round wild card type of action?
Well, you got to be consistent with the way that you play the game, and I think that that's also been a struggle for them at times because it was all well and good during the 5-game winning streak when they never trailed in a game, and as soon as they face some adversity, they're not a great team when it comes to trying to play from behind and come back from these games. And there are teams out there that are starting to find their footing again from slow starts. One of the things I mentioned, and I was on the air with Josh Hennig on game night on ahead of the Tuesday night game against Carolina, and one of the things I brought up to him was, this is as tight at Thanksgiving as I've seen the standings in a long time in terms of just how many teams are in a position to potentially change that percentage point. I think it's something like 75-80% of teams that are in a playoff spot on Thanksgiving tend to make the playoffs. I don't know that that's going to hold up this year because of the fact that there's just so many teams. I believe it's something like from 8th place in the standings to 25th in the standings are separated by 5 or 6 points. And that's just pure insanity waiting to happen in the standings. So when you're looking at a team like the Flyers that on certain nights, especially, I think that game against the Rangers is a really good example of this, that when you watch them play a game like that and you see that the Rangers are at the top of the standings for a reason and the Flyers don't have the talent level to compete with a team like that night in, night out anyway. And that is really going to be what makes a difference for me moving forward, is because when you see that happen once, the potential is always there. Sure, the potential is also always there for them to win a game. I think that their work ethic allows for that, and I don't think that their work ethic has been lacking on most nights of the season. Maybe, hold for a game or two out of these first 20 or so games that they've played. But they're going to have to still find a way consistently. And part of finding a way is that you can't just be the team that doesn't find a way to come back when you're falling behind early in a game. You've got to eventually work your way out of that and win games in a bunch of different styles. And to this point, I haven't seen that. There's time for them to turn that around in their favor. There's also time for this to go in the opposite direction. And for teams that are behind them, one of the teams is a team they're going to face on Thursday night when they play the New Jersey Devils. They're behind them in the standings right now, but that was a team that dealt with some injuries, and that was a team that got off to a slow start and is now maybe starting to find their footing a little bit. And as they do, the Flyers can't afford to go into long losing streaks, kind of like what they're not on a losing streak per se, but losing 3 out of 4 is the start of something that can become bigger when you look at the big picture. So that's the thing they have to try to avoid if they want to stay within this race. And it's going to be a challenge when there's so many teams that are going to feel like they're in contention right there knocking on the door as well.
Especially going into a game like tomorrow with the Devils. The lineup right now isn't necessarily changing as much as it was, but we do have a couple of injuries that are putting play into the lineup. Ristolainen is coming back into the lineup, and Cates is coming out of the lineup. How do you think, especially in a divisional game like against the New Jersey Devils tomorrow, that that's going to be affecting this lineup in the upcoming week?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that comes into play right away is when you take a guy like Noah Cates out of the lineup, who's kind of been in between in certain situations. They've played him at center for a majority of the year. They moved him to wing for that last game that he played on Saturday to try to see if it could unlock some offensive opportunities, because he hasn't produced at the rate that he was last season. He's maintained the defensive play. He hasn't really produced offensively. And regardless of where you have him at the moment or where he was playing when the injury happened, he was mostly a center. And this makes you incredibly thin at center at the moment. I mean, you're going to put Morgan Frost back into the lineup as a result of this with regularity because he'll go into that forward slot for the time being. But you're still thin because behind Sean Couturier and Morgan Frost, you're pretty much left with moving Scott Lawton back to center, which is not necessarily his primary position over the last 2-3 years. He's been more of a winger in the last handful of years. And you're going to continue to probably try to see if Ryan Poehling can stay up in the lineup and maybe play top 9 minutes as opposed to being on your fourth line. And I wonder how long they'll be able to kind of get away with that before it kind of creeps in. You're already seeing kind of it creep in from the offensive standpoint that these guys aren't point producers like that necessarily. Can they be really good defensive centers? That's possible. They both play penalty kill. They both have the ability, but how long can that last also when you have teams like this that come in and play with four lines the way that they do? The Devils especially. The Devils have really grown that over the last handful of seasons to get that talent level, to have guys that fit different roles and play across the lineup, and it works out in their favor a lot of the time. Another thing about the Devils game in particular is, they play that same style in terms of and the style they always have, which is to clog the neutral zone, not allow for a lot in terms of transition. And this is a team, the Flyers are a team that are really heavily reliant on transitional rushes and making reads in the neutral zone. Those are kind of two areas that I've seen them really push hard to try to create offense from. And if they're not able to do that, then you see how difficult it is for them to set up offense in kind of other ways at least for right now, because they are lacking in a lot of areas in terms of the talent level when it comes to some of these other teams, and the injuries are going to play into that as well. Now, maybe a guy like Ristolainen back in the lineup helps a little bit in terms of the physicality. You're going to play a team that I'm sure likes to play physical. The Devils are that kind of mold as well. So that might help you in that respect. And Ristolainen's been fine for the 2 games he's been back so far. Didn't look out of place, didn't look like he was a weak link. So that plays into your favor a little bit, but you're going to have to still overcome those obstacles, especially as you have guys kind of come in, come out, balancing out young guys with veterans, things that we've talked about in the past. And yet you still have to also kind of wonder what that forward group looks like now that you're taking a guy who's played every single game, for the most part, played decent minutes, and now he's out for nearly 2 months at this rate. So you got a lot to figure out there, and a lot of situations to fill, because Cates could really play in almost any situation. He doesn't really see power play time, but he's definitely a penalty killer, definitely a defensive minded centerman, trying to see what he could do offensively if you put him on the wing. And now you got to fill all of that. And, there's not necessarily an answer to that, maybe within the 12-man roster, forward roster that they're going to have going forward in terms of just putting Morgan Frost back in or Bobby Brink back in or however it works. You're going to need a bunch of different guys to step up to fill that void.
We touched on it a little bit earlier about how there's so much changing in the season right now and so much kind of developing and moving around. And it seems to be getting to the point of the season where people are starting to look at the big picture, the future picture, the playoff picture. There was a trade yesterday. Vancouver traded Anthony Beauvillier to Chicago, and we touched a little bit on trades last week. Do you think it could be the time in the season for them to start looking at trades to start to fill these lacks of, how you're talking about the lack of centers now that there's an injury? Is there a future we could look at from outside of the current people we have in this organization to start filling these gaps in our lineups?
I'm not sure that the time is now for that necessarily. The impression that I get is that they're not interested in being on the buyer side of the equation, or that they're not looking to add and give up assets to do that. The other side of that equation, though, which you kind of alluded to, is it necessarily a time to make trades maybe in a different direction? And I'm not saying to just go full on selling, but if a guy's value is as high as it's going to get and somebody hits you with a good offer, do you consider it? And I know a player that's getting talked about a lot in this respect is Sean Walker, who for the most part was a throw-in in the Ivan Provorov trade from Los Angeles, mostly just a salary cap dump, and has turned out to have a pretty solid season to this point. And if he can, if there's teams that are already inquiring about him and the idea of him being somebody that the team might be interested in trading, you have to think about it at this point. And I think that, you kind of posed the question from the forward group a little bit more. And yes, right now they have 12 forwards that are healthy and called up at the moment, and that could change. They could call somebody else up if they wanted to. But for the most part, it seems like they're going to just move forward with the group of 12. But when you look at the defensive group and the fact that now Mark Stahl comes back to the lineup, Rasmus Ristolainen comes back to the lineup, you still have Igor Zamula and Louis Belpedio who are up on the active roster. So currently your roster has 8 defensemen on it. If somebody called you tomorrow and made you the type of offer that you can't refuse for Sean Walker, you may be willing to go ahead and do it at this point, just because you actually have other guys who are within the organization who are up, who are prepared to go into the lineup, and it wouldn't really result in you missing a beat at this moment. It's probably still too soon for you to get what you think you could, cap out at in terms of what the return for Walker could be. So I don't think it's going to be something that's imminent by any stretch, but you never know. Teams start to consider different things when names are out there. I know a lot of the rumblings when it came to that trade that Vancouver made for involving Beauvillier. First of all, a roster spot was opening up in Chicago, conveniently enough for Vancouver. And there's rumors that Vancouver's looking at a player like Nikita Zadorov, who is out there. And maybe that's the type of move you make to free up some cap space, to free up a roster spot. Sometimes teams are willing to take that leap when someone becomes available and find a way to do something that works for them as well. You don't see it a lot in November and December, but stranger things, especially with so many teams in kind of in the running right now. And, I even look at a team like Calgary, for example, because Calgary 3-4 weeks ago was, as far as I'm concerned, for a lot of people, was dead in the water. They were down at the bottom of the standings. It looked like they had no shot at making the playoffs, and now they're right in the thick of the playoff race again. And that's how quickly things can change. You go on a bit of a winning streak, you have some successful moments, some successful nights, and string them together. You might be right back in this race, and you might be thinking about what you have to do moving forward to get over that hump and be part of the playoff picture if a trade is part of the equation. So I wouldn't rule anything out for any team, and the Flyers especially, because of the fact that at this point, when you think about the two people who are going to be most involved in those decisions, Keith Jones and Danny Briere, and the job that they have to do, I don't think that you can look at where they are in the standings right now either, and not, and overlook the fact that it's the first season that you have where you said publicly it's the rebuild. It's the first season where you're trying to build to something bigger in the future. And you can't lose sight of the fact that somebody out there may be willing to give you something substantial for one of your players because they know where you stand and they feel like as a team that maybe they could take one of these players and make something out of them and maybe turn that into a playoff appearance of their own. So that comes into play as well when it comes to the trade market. I just don't anticipate the Flyers necessarily being the most active team in terms of additions anyway. And certainly when it comes to maybe selling off some pieces, trying to get something in return for some of these one-year contracts or anything like that, it's probably just a little bit too early at this point to really go into that conversation. I think that once you get to January, it starts to ramp up a little bit, especially as we get some more clarity in the playoff picture, because right now I think everybody just likes their team and likes the way that things are going and thinks they can make the playoffs based on what the standings say today, as opposed to what they will in a month or two.
So the Flyers are going to be playing the New Jersey Devils tomorrow at home. It is kind of like a stadium series preview, if you please. So I think there's going to be a lot of buzz around that going on. We're both going to be at the game tomorrow. You'll be up in the press box. I'll be in the stands. So there'll be a lot of coverage on the game tomorrow, both on the social media platforms and through you on the ESPN website with a preview and a post game. You can keep up with all of that on 97.3, whether you use the online app or Instagram. And we will be back again next week to wrap up another week of Flyers playing.